The wind had teeth that afternoon, sharp enough to bite through linen and skin alike, and it carried with it the dry scent of dust and old blood as Eli Mercer reined his horse beneath the spreading cottonwood, the same tree that had watched him bury his father and swear never to come back broken. And yet here he was, older, heavier in the eyes, staring at something that made the world tilt. A woman bound by one ankle to a low branch, her body stretched sideways in a cruel arc, dress torn along the ribs and thigh, fabric fluttering like a white flag that had lost its war, her free hand pressed to the dirt to steady herself while her other arm trembled in the air. And for a heartbeat, he thought she was dead until she lifted her face and spoke with a voice scraped raw by fear and pride, saying, "It's torn. Take it off for me," not as a plea but as a command carved from necessity. And Eli stepped closer before sense could catch him, froze when recognition struck like a hammer to the chest. Because beneath the dust and the wildness of her hair he knew those eyes, that stubborn set of the mouth, the woman he had loved once under a different sky. Maeve Calder, who had left him with a letter and a ring and the promise that some roads were meant to split, and now the road had twisted back on itself to mock him. The ranch lay quiet behind him, corrals empty, barns leaning, the land tired from years of drought and taking, and his horses stood uneasy, snorting as if they too felt the wrongness of the scene, while Eli's mind raced through the rules he'd learned to live by in a country that didn't forgive softness, rules about distance and honor, and not touching what could ruin you. But her dress was caught and torn, where the branch had hooked it when she'd tried to run or climb or flee, whatever, had chased her here. And the tear exposed bruises that spoke of a recent struggle, purple and yellow like storms trapped under skin. And when she met his gaze, there was no accusation. There, only the cold truth of survival, the kind that doesn't wait for old feelings to settle. He remembered her laugh in a churchyard once, remembered how she smelled of sage and sweat, remembered how he'd chosen the ranch over following her east, telling himself that love was a luxury a man couldn't afford when the land needed him. And now the land watched as he stood useless while she hung half-naked and defiant from his father's tree, and the words she'd spoken rang again with a different meaning, not just about cloth, but about the past, about the lies they'd wrapped themselves in, and he felt the pull to reach out, to cut the binding rope with his knife, to gather her before the world could take another piece. Yet something held him back, a prickle at the nape of his neck, the sense that eyes were on them, that the West never staged such moments without an audience or a price. Maeve shifted, pain flashing across her face, and told him low that the branch was tearing deeper with that every breath, that if he didn't act, she would fall wrong and break. And still he hesitated, seeing in his mind the last time he'd touched her, the night he'd refused to leave, the way she'd looked at him as if healed in fits and starts, pain and laughter appearing without warning. And Eli found himself changing too, his routines bending around another heartbeat, another presence that filled the cabin with something like warmth and something like danger, because the land had always taken its payment in the end. When she asked him why he lived alone, he told her the truth as he knew it, that some men were shaped by loss until there was no room left for anyone else. And when she told him she had been promised to a man who never came, left to rot on a trail that forgot her name, Eli felt the old anger stir, the one that had buried his brother and burned his father's fields, the one that whispered violence was a language the West understood best. It was on the 7th night, when her fever broke and the wind howled like something alive outside the walls, that Clara looked at him with a steadiness that made his chest ache and said she had nowhere to go. And Eli realized that the question forming between them was not one either of them had spoken aloud, because speaking, it would make it real, would bind them tighter than rope or law. He thought of the sheriff 2 towns over, of the way the world judged women who survived and men who helped them. And he thought of the empty years ahead if he sent her away. And as he stood there, caught between the silence he had mastered and the life pressing in on him, a distant gunshot cracked the night open, close enough to rattle the window panes, close enough to remind him that whatever fate he was stepping into had already found the trail to his door. The gunshot did not come again, but it left a silence behind so thick it felt nailed to the walls, and Eli stood there with his hand resting on the worn stock of his rifle, listening not just with his ears, but with the old instinct that had kept him alive when others were buried under bad luck and worse decisions. And in that listening, he understood that the life he had been living, quiet, narrow, carefully starved of attachment, had already ended the moment he'd lifted Clara Wynne out of the dust and blood and told himself it was only for a while. He stepped out into the night, the cold biting sharper now that fear had given it teeth, and saw a lantern glow flicker near the cottonwoods by the creek, moving slow and deliberate like a man who wanted to be seen. And Eli felt the truth settle heavy in his chest that the West never let debts go unpaid. It only waited until you forgot what you owed. The man who emerged from the trees was tall and thin, his coat too fine for honest work and too worn for comfort. And when he spoke Clara's name like it belonged to him, Eli knew the past had finally come calling with both fists. The stranger said his name was Vernon Hale, and that Clara was promised, bought, and paid for by ink on paper and witnesses who did not care whether she lived long enough to understand what she had signed. And Eli watched Clara stand in the doorway behind him, pale but unbroken, her hand resting against the frame as if she were testing whether it would hold her weight if she leaned into the truth. Vernon smiled when Eli told him to leave, smiled like a man used to getting his way after wearing others down, and he said there were laws for these things, laws written by men who looked a lot like him. And Eli felt something inside him tighten and harden because he had seen what laws did to people who were already bleeding. The first punch came sudden and clumsy, Vernon lunging when Eli turned his head for half a second, and it knocked him sideways into the dirt, the taste of iron filling his mouth as old memories flared. Fists in saloons, boots in alleys, the night his brother never got back up. And he rose slower this time, knowing speed was for young men and certainty was what kept you standing. They fought under the stars with no witnesses but the land, a brutal, breath-stealing struggle that left both of them marked. And when Eli finally drove Vernon back with the rifle butt cracking against bone, the man staggered and laughed even as blood ran down his chin, promising to return with papers and men and the kind of force that made right and wrong irrelevant. When he disappeared into the dark, Eli stood shaking, not from fear but from the understanding that violence had marked his door now.
Mountain more than the map. And when he reached town, the bell at the church was half buried and silent. Doors drifted shut, windows frosted opaque, and the faces that finally gathered when he shouted his name were hollowed by hunger and fear. Eyes flicking from his beard rhymed with ice to the cave behind him in their minds, the place they had mocked, the place they had dismissed as madness. And in that moment, Elias felt the old anger rise, hot and useless, and let it pass, because anger wastes heat, and heat was a currency no one could afford. He brought them what he could carry, salt meat, grain, a spare stovepipe, knowledge of how to bank a fire so it lived through the night. And when a mother fell to her knees and wept into his coat, he stood stiff as a post, because comfort had been taken from him, and he did not know how to give it back without breaking. And yet he did what needed doing, splitting wood until his shoulders screamed, showing them how to brace roofs, how to listen for the sound that meant a beam was about to go, how to follow the river's voice under ice. And the town's disbelief began to thaw into something else, something like shame or gratitude or the uneasy recognition that salvation sometimes wears the face you refuse to learn. On the fifth night the storm deepened instead of lifting, the wind finding new ways to enter lungs and walls, and a rumor cut through the gathered fear like a blade. The missing child had been seen near Widowmaker Ridge, drawn by light or lost by drift, and the town turned as one toward Elias, toward the cave they had named as a joke and now named as hope. And Elias felt destiny's weight settle where his wife's hand used to rest, heavy and intimate, because he knew the mountain would not give life. Without taking, knew caves remember promises, and as he pulled on his gloves and turned back into the white with a lantern swinging low, he understood that belief comes late and costs dearly, and that before the blizzard broke, the mountain would ask him to pay. The wind shrieked like a chorus of the lost as Elias Crow pressed deeper into the blinding white, the lantern swinging like a pendulum of hope, each step a negotiation with the mountain that had both sheltered and cursed him, and he could hear the child's cries somewhere ahead, muffled by drift and ice, a thin thread of sound that tugged at a part of him he had thought dead when his own family had been stolen by fate's indifferent hand. Frostfall's people followed as best they could, huddled. Behind his horse, faces streaked with snow and tears, trusting a man they had mocked for years, and Elias knew that their lives now rested not on law or prayer, but on his stubborn understanding of wind, stone, and the quiet whispers of the cave, the kind of knowledge passed down only through silence and suffering, because the mountain never forgives ignorance. Hours stretched like eternity, every ridge a new trial, snowdrifts swallowing boots and sleds, and the child's voice grew weaker, fear mingling with the cold until it became almost unrecognizable. Yet Elias held on, calling out, guiding, steadying, his own breath a white cloud mingling with the storm's howl, and for the first time he felt the full weight of his solitude, the cabin back in the cave, a fragile memory of warmth and promise, a symbol of endurance that had prepared him for this moment when the world demanded everything he had left to give. When they reached the narrow cliff ledge where the child had been trapped, dangling over a frozen ravine, Elias's heart stopped in a way grief had never taught him, a stillness that made every frozen pine a witness, and without hesitation he dismounted, rope coiled over shoulder, gloves stiff with frost, each motion a prayer to the stone and sky, and with hands that burned and bled, he anchored himself and lowered down, whispering the child's name as if calling her through a dream, until he felt the slight weight, a small body trembling,